Hola a todos, bienvenidos, soy Hawani. Now, as most of you know, including myself, most of us are currently studying Spanish, but we don't live in a Spanish-speaking country. Now, personally, for me, I've been studying Spanish now for 5.5 years, and one phrase in particular that I thought would offer you guys a lot of value, because I hear this one spoken by native speakers all the time, is the phrase, a pesar de. For example, a pesar de ser ricos, no compramos cosas caras. Or, a pesar de estar cansado, quiero salir con mis amigos. As you can see, it's a very useful phrase. You'll hear this one a lot. So give me 5 or 6 minutes. What we'll do is we'll break it all down. We'll go through some specific examples and exercises so that by the end of this video, you'll be able to add this useful phrase into your Spanish conversations. Now, to start with, what does the phrase a pesar de in Spanish actually mean? So it means despite or in spite of if we're translating it to English. But one thing to really remember is that if we translate it word for word, it doesn't actually make sense. As a lot of you might already know, the verb pesar actually means to weigh. So the first thing to acknowledge is just to ignore the word for word translation and just think of a pesar de as its own unique phrase. The second thing to remember is that when we think of despite or in spite of, when we're using it in English, what we're basically doing is we're presenting an idea or we're presenting a partial obstacle, but this partial obstacle isn't stopping a particular action, if that makes sense. So the best way to explain this is to give you an example. So if we look at this example here, a pesar de no hablar francés, vivimos en Francia. A pesar de no hablar francés, vivimos en Francia. So despite not speaking French, we live in France. Now you can see if we break this example down, the partial obstacle here in this example is not speaking French, but despite that or in spite of that, we are living or we live in France. So the partial obstacle isn't stopping the action. Now, what else do you notice about the verb hablar in this situation? Yeah, so most of you will notice that the verb hablar is unconjugated. It's in its infinitive form. So the beauty of this phrase is that if we're using a verb straight after this, we don't have to conjugate the verb, which in turn makes it a lot easier for us when we're adding this into our conversation. Cool, so I think that's starting to make sense. Now, one question you might be thinking is, can we use this in the past tense as well? And the answer is yes. So to give you an example, a pesar de tener poco dinero, Antonio ha viajado mucho. A pesar de tener poco dinero, Antonio ha viajado mucho. So in this example, you can see here that again, the verb tener is unchanged. It's in its unconjugated infinitive form like we mentioned in the previous example. But you'll see we're using the verb haber as an auxiliary again, and we're using it in the past tense to say, despite Antonio not having a lot of money, he has traveled a lot. Good job, everyone. Now, another question you might be thinking to yourself right now is, Hawani, can we use this phrase with a noun or a pronoun straight after it? And the answer is yes. So to give you an example, a pesar de mis padres, he comprado los coches. A pesar de mis padres, he comprado los coches. Cool. Now, before we move on, one really important thing I want you to remember, because I used to make this mistake all the time, and the best way to demonstrate this is to go for another example, but pay attention to the verb haber and tell me what you notice. So the example is, a pesar de haber estudiado español toda la semana, no he entendido mucho. A pesar de haber estudiado español toda la semana, no he entendido mucho. So, despite having studied Spanish all week, I haven't understood a lot. Now, do you notice something with the verb haber in the first instance? So one thing you might notice is that in the first instance, when we're using the verb haber in this particular example, the verb haber is unconjugated, even though we're using it in the past tense. So, a pesar de haber estudiado. So, haber is unchanged, so it's always going to be unchanged in its infinitive form after this particular phrase. But you'll also notice with the verb estudiar, we'd still have to conjugate that in English as if it's got the ed on the end of it. So, study or studied in English. And don't forget everyone, if you are getting any value from these videos, I would really appreciate it if you'd consider liking the button or subscribing if you haven't already. Now, one really cool thing about this phrase is that we can use this in a particular way where we can really extract or come up with some really useful sentences. And the way we do that is using these two examples. So we've got a pesar de eso, or a pesar de todo. So think of these two examples in English. It's quite common to say despite that or despite everything. That's basically what these two phrases here in Spanish actually mean. So to give you an example, no tenemos mucho dinero, pero a pesar de eso, vamos a comprar una casa. No tenemos mucho dinero, pero a pesar de eso, vamos a comprar una casa. So we don't have a lot of money, but despite that, we're going to buy a house. You can see there it's a very, very useful phrase. Now, to finish off with, let's go through a few exercises. As per normal, you know what to do. I'm going to give you a sentence in English, and then I want you to translate it for me over into Spanish. El número uno, how would you say this? Despite not having energy, I'm going to the gym. So despite not having energy, I'm going to the gym. How would you say that? This time you'd say, a pesar de no tener energía, voy al gimnasio. Again, a pesar de no tener energía, voy al gimnasio. Cool, let's go another one. How would you say this? Despite my friends, I have chosen another university. Despite my friends, I have chosen another university. This time you'd say, a pesar de mis amigos, he elegido otra universidad. Again, a pesar de mis amigos, he elegido otra universidad. Great work, everyone. Now, what really works for me is writing out a few examples or a few sentences so that you become familiar with the construction of it. And then once you're more comfortable with it, then trying to add some of these into your Spanish conversations. So give that a go. If I can help with anything else, of course, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one. Hasta pronto.